And Mark was a first-century Christian, a cousin of Barnabas, cooperator of the apostles, and author of the second gospel of the New Testament that bears his name. Although not nominally cited in the gospel he wrote, Mark is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles and Apostolic Letters. His Hebrew name was John, which means Yahweh showed grace. But like many Jews of his day, he took over the Latin surname Mark. Therefore, he is often designated as John Mark. Although it was common for Jews to adopt Roman or Greek names in the first century, especially in situations where they were released from a condition of slavery, which was not his case. It is difficult to know because he adopted that name, since Mark is not exactly a surname, but a pre-name. John Mark was a Jew probably native to Jerusalem. Her mother was named Mary and was a relative of Barnabas, travel companion of the Apostle Paul. Because your father is not cited sometimes, it is possible that Mary, her mother, was already widowed at the time when the reports narrated in the Acts of the Apostles book. Apparently, John Marcos belonged to a sufficient family, since his mother's house seemed to be great enough to serve as a place of early church meeting, and had at least one created by the name of Rodowd. Marcos was taken by Barnabas and Paul to Antioch and soon after accompanied them on the first missionary trip, serving as their assistant. However, when they arrived in Perg, Asia Minor, John Mark decided to abandon them and return to Jerusalem. Paulo and Barnabas continued the trip alone. But the Apostle Paul clearly disapproved of Marcos's attitude and later, considering him a deserter, Paul refused to take him on his second missionary trip. On the other hand, Barnabas was not willing to give up his company, and in the face of this impasse, Paulo and Barnabas decided to follow different directions. Barnabas continued with Marcos and departed to Cyprus, while Paul took him Silas and gave his second mission journey procedure. Although we have no information about the period in which Marcos accompanied Barnabas, we can certainly say that he was very well discipled, a point that Paul himself recognizes his value. About 10 or 12 years after the incident with Marcos, when the apostle wrote the epistle to Colossians while being arrested in Rome, Marcos is quoted by him, including being recommended by him to the Christian community of Colossos. If Marcos was not with the apostle in Rome on this occasion, at least he was very close to him. On the same occasion, in writing Philemon, the apostle Paul also mentions him alongside Lucas, Aristarchus, and two, which he designates as his CO workers. Finally, on the occasion of Paul's second arrest in Rome, approximately 66 and 67 AD, the apostle asked Marcos to be to Rome, because he was very useful in ministry, proving that by this time, Marcos had already shown great use in contrast to his inconsequential behavior as younger. Marcos appears again being quoted by the apostle Peter in his first epistle, where the apostle called him a son, indicating that over time Marcos played a very significant role alongside the apostles. In this epistle, the apostle Peter says he is in Babylon, which would probably be a reference to the city of Rome of his day. This means that Marcos was in this city with him, information that contributed to confirm the tradition that Mark wrote the second gospel there, having as its main historical source the apostle Peter himself. However, there is a great difficulty in determining an exact date for the composition of the second gospel, which may indicate that Mark perhaps written in a period closer to the year 40 AD, even before his deserting on the missionary trip. Anyway, as Pedro designates him my son, regardless of the date, it seems clear that his connection with the apostle was very large and makes even on a very retreated date. It is quite possible that Pedro had a fundamental contribution in the composition of Mark's records. There are many speculation about who was milestones in ancient Christian traditions. Some of them put him as the founder of the Church of Alexandria, but there is no evidence in this regard. Many scholars also identify Mark as the young man who appears covered only by a sheet the night Jesus was arrested and who, as he escaped the temple police, ended up leaving the sheet behind. This suggestion has been recognized as very likely, since this episode is narrated especially in the gospel that bears its name. Taking advantage of this interpretation pointed out above, some also suggest that Mark was the man who carried a water flower at the time of preparations for the celebration of Easter. Others propose that perhaps it was not him, but his father, who was still alive at the time. If this hypothesis is correct, then the house in which Jesus celebrated the supper was the same house as Mary mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, who later welcomed the believers of Jerusalem. There are also those who argue that Mark would have been one of 70 missionaries sent by the Lord Jesus. But this hypothesis does not have much support. It is also true that some traditions point to a possible martyrdom of Mark, but there is nothing to prove this assumption. Leaving speculation aside, writer William Hendrickson, in his New Testament comment, provides us with an excellent answer about who Mark was, by saying he was not a great leader or a remarkable builder, but a follower and helper. He was not someone without defects. On the contrary, he was a person who fought his weaknesses and won them. The text of this study they will find on our website. The link is in the video description. On our website, you will be able to access the biographies of many biblical characters, as well as hundreds of other studies of various topics. Also, take the opportunity to download our official app for free and receive all our studies on your mobile phone.